be with you this morning. And I also want to thank all of you for your willingness to hear this message this morning. It's a privilege for me to be in front of this congregation as part of this faith community. As I look over your 7 principles, you might imagine that I'm most attracted to principle number 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. That's been my life's work, and maybe when you think of the principles of this faith community, you don't think so much about journalism, but I have to tell you that those of us who have followed a career path in journalism, we are indeed dedicated to that same principle, the pursuit of truth. We are here this morning, and I'm able to tell you the story behind South Dakota News Watch. You are here able to gather as a worshiping community, as a faith community, because of events that occurred some 230 years ago, when the founding fathers of this country came together to write a constitution and then send it on to the states for ratification. That ratification was not a slam dunk. There were major concerns about a centralized federal government and concerns that individual liberties would not be protected. James Madison received a letter from Thomas Jefferson in 1787. Jefferson told his friend, James Madison, what an amazing document they had drafted and sent on to the states for ratification, but he had a major word of caution. A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, and what no just government should refuse. So as the Constitution was circulated among the states, it was the lack of a Bill of Rights that was the rallying cry for those who opposed the ratification of our Constitution. Eventually, of course, it was ratified by the states, but the first Congress then took up what we now know to be a Bill of Rights. There were actually 12 articles or amendments, not 10, but 12 that were circulated among the states. And what was finally ratified on December 15th, 1791, were 10 of those amendments or articles. So what we know today as the First Amendment, actually in its original form, would have been the Third Amendment. But the first 2 were not accepted by the states. And so the states ratified this, and we have these first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution known as the Bill of Rights. What an extraordinary document protecting our civil liberties against a strong centralized federal government. We had had enough of a strong centralized government with the king, and so being able to protect our civil liberties was absolutely essential to the health of the republic and to society. On the front of your bulletins are those words contained in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I don't want to read them. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. 5 basic freedoms protected by the First Amendment. They are, this is the participatory portion of the message this morning. Those 5 freedoms protected by the First Amendment are religion, press, speech,
Freedom of assembly.
peaceful assembly, and the 5th, petition. Now, we have an example of that today with the petition that Sheldon Osborne is urging you to sign, I assume for an initiated measure in South Dakota. 45 words. That's all it is, 45 words. Beautifully crafted. James Madison was the author. Unchanged for 228 years. Those 45 words have been unchanged, but the interpretation and application of the First Amendment certainly has evolved and changed substantially over those 228 years. Michael gave you a little bit of my background. I am a South Dakotan by choice, been here for 26 years, a lifelong journalist. But how did I end up being a journalist, and how did I end up coming to South Dakota? I was born in Western New York, upstate New York. Born into a loving family. I was the youngest of 4 children. I'm a baby boomer, so it was right after the Second World War. I'm now 70 years old. My father, who had an enormous influence on me, was an elected official. Held elected office in New York State for over 35 years. He exemplified integrity. And my father, who was both a prosecutor, a judge, and then ended up being one of the top jurists, leading jurists and most respected jurists in New York State, really helped introduce to me the importance of a free and independent press, particularly in its watchdog role over institutions, over government, over the affairs of society. 2 small newspapers in upstate New York, in Utica, New York, in 1958, fulfilling their watchdog role, their responsibilities under the First Amendment, began writing about corruption and graft involving government officials and others, and organized crime in the community of Utica, New York, which is the geographic center of New York State. Elaborate coverage and really exposed for the first time an incredible system of corruption that so far had been tolerated in Utica, New York. That got the attention of the then governor of New York State, Averell Harriman. That name will be familiar to many of you. And Averell Harriman, as the governor, and under the powers granted to him, decided that it was worthy of a special grand jury investigation, a special prosecutor, another term that we're quite familiar with these days. And so he appointed an outside prosecutor. Perhaps he didn't trust what might happen with the local district attorney, or which is the position that's the equivalent of a state's attorney here in South Dakota. So sent in an outside prosecutor, and he also usurped the local judicial system and sent in an outside judge. That judge was my father. And as this grand jury investigation began, the newspapers won the Pulitzer Prize in 1958. It was actually awarded in 1959. They received the gold medal for public service. That's the highest of the Pulitzer Prizes in journalism. My father presided over that investigation as the judge and over a series of trials, and worked in Utica, New York for 4 years. And throughout that time, I was a young man, but when I was able, I would go with my father to Utica, and we'd spend overnight. Maybe he had hearings or sentencing or whatever. And my father would tell me about the importance of a free and vigorous and independent press for the sake of a community. The role that that responsible newspapers really can play in holding up a mirror to a community and saying, this is what's going on, folks. Are we going to tolerate this, or are we going to take action? And my father really credited those two newspapers in Utica, New York, with transforming a community from being, there was institutional corruption, going from that to being a healthy and well-functioning local government and well-functioning community. That caught my attention. And at that time, I would have been, when I started going there, I was 10 years old. By the time we finished up, I was about 14. Well, I will tell you that from age 15 on, all I ever wanted to be was a reporter, a journalist. And due to a set of circumstances, I was able to do that. Spent my entire career in journalism, really inspired by what had happened in Utica, New York, by what my father would tell me about the importance of a newspaper that truly cares about its community. 20 years later, after that grand jury investigation wrapped up, a young journalist, still in his 30s, was appointed, hired as the editor of those two newspapers. I was that person. And I get chills when I think about it. That this makes a circle, and to think that my father presided over this special investigation, over all these trials. That was my inspiration to go into journalism, and then I had the enormous privilege and responsibility of editing those same two newspapers that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1959. My career, if I include the years that my college years, I've worked for 8 newspapers in 5 states. I worked for the Gannett Company from the time I graduated from college until I wrapped up my career here in Sioux Falls as executive editor of the Argus Leader. Would have been, my goodness, 21 years ago. It's been a long time. And at that point, I went to work for a national media foundation, a First Amendment foundation, started by Al Newharth, distinguished and famous South Dakota. And I had, again, the high privilege of working directly for Al Newharth for the last 15 years of his life, and on a national scale, working on programs to increase diversity in journalism and to uphold the highest possible professional standards, ethical and professional standards for the industry, a number of initiatives. And so I was able to, at the end, I had offices in Washington and Nashville, and at the Al Newharth Media Center at USD in Vermillion. So I then wrapped up that career 5 years ago and retired. So what is going on with this, with the Fourth Estate? What kind of shape is it in? It's in terrible shape. The Wall Street Journal published an in-depth piece last month, and I brought extra copies if we get into that discussion after the service. I'd be glad to share these with you. But the Wall Street Journal took a look at what has happened in professional journalism, in the media, and specifically with newspapers over the last several years, and sounds the alarm that local newspapers are vanishing. They are vanishing. And we should be very concerned about that, because most original reporting, that is researched reporting, I'm not talking about aggregating of stories, but the original research or reporting of stories, most of that in this country occurs at newspapers. And local newspapers are absolutely essential, I believe, to the health of any community. The numbers are staggering. Nearly 1,800 newspapers have closed since 2004. Newspaper newsrooms have been cut in half. newsroom jobs have been cut in half over the last 10 years. From the time I left the newspaper business, which has now been 21 years, I mean, it is an absolutely precipitous fall. It's been a perfect storm. First, there's something called Craigslist. And you may say, what does Craigslist have to do with the downfall of newspapers or my concerns about journalism? Craigslist was, instead of people placing classified advertising in newspapers, they would go to Craigslist. And now there are all sorts of variations on Craigslist. We now think about all the offerings of the internet. So initially there was an immediate and very quick drop in revenue from classified advertising. That then, as the internet became even more robust, there was a gravitation of advertising from newspapers to the internet and to the various platforms available there. And that then meant that the newspapers were no longer profitable. They could no longer support these very robust staffs, and so the cuts began, and they continue. So newspapers are closing, but those that are staying, are still operating, are doing so with much reduced staffs, and we should be concerned about that, because when there isn't a journalist there watching, bad things can happen, and my fear is that if we don't have a robust, free, and independent press in this country, in this state, in this community, that things could get even worse. Add to that the position taken by our president. This is what he says about me and about my colleagues. That I am scum, that I am among the most dishonest people on the planet, that I'm an enemy of the people. Because when he says that about journalists, when he says that about the mainstream media, he's talking about me and everybody else in my profession who indeed are dedicated to pursuit of the truth and to the very highest professional and ethical standards. It started it during the campaign. He has continued it, and I mean, it's a daily occurrence. This is just from this morning, and the president is having a Twitter storm this morning. I'll read from 2 different tweets this morning. I know it is not at all presidential to hit back at the corrupt media or the people who work for the corrupt media when they make false statements about me or the Trump administration. Problem is, if you don't hit back, people believe the fake news is true. So we will hit back. And then an excerpt from a second tweet this morning. The failing New York Times and ratings-challenged CNN will do anything possible to see our country fail. They are truly the enemy of the people. Here's the danger, that people actually will believe the president. Now, I assume that in this room that many professions, occupations, trades are represented. I dare say that every one of you, you're probably proud of the work you have done in life, proud of your professions, your occupations, your colleagues. I have that same sense of pride for the profession of journalism. And for someone to suggest that we have a disregard for truth, that we embrace fakery, that we are enemies of the people, I find that to be offensive, outrageous, and dangerous for our nation. So what does all this have to do with South Dakota News Watch? Well, before Mr. Trump was elected president, I guess even before he declared he was a candidate, I was wrapping up my career, and so was another friend of mine, Randall Beck. Randall was editor and then publisher of the Argus Leader, And at the time he was about to retire, he was also chair of the Pulitzer Prize Committee, Pulitzer Prize Board at Columbia University. Randall and I would get together and we expressed deep concern about the dwindling resources in journalism, about really a shift in a shift in the attitude of the public toward the media. And we concluded that we couldn't resolve or address the situation nationally, but perhaps we could make a difference here in South Dakota. So Randall Beck and I set out and started talking to news leaders throughout the state, broadcasters, newspaper people, other folks who we thought could be our allies in trying to figure out what we might do differently in South Dakota, because this decline in resources that we've seen nationally is just as bad in South Dakota. When I came to this state 26 years ago, the Associated Press, as I recall, had a staff of about 12 in South Dakota. Today, they have no one in South Dakota. The Argus Leader, when I was the editor, I recall I had a staff of about 75 people in the newsroom. Today, it is less than 20. They are good people. They are outstanding professionals, but you simply cannot provide the same level of coverage. You cannot fulfill the watchdog role as effectively with 18 people as we once did with 75. So Randall and I went around the state and said, hey, do you agree we have a problem here and there are dwindling resources, and is there some concern that maybe we could address together? And we were embraced. And so we did further research and discovered that throughout the country there's a whole new approach to journalism, nonprofit, independent journalism organizations. There are now about 150 of us. The best known of them is ProPublica, which has already won 4 Pulitzer Prizes. That's the standard that we seek to achieve. And so essentially, Randall Beck and I put together a board. We got all our governance documents in order. We got our 501c3 designation, started raising some money, and we launched with 1 full-time investigative reporter and 1 half-time editor about a little less than a year and a half ago. It was February of last year. What we distributed, a handout we distributed, is a list of the stories that we have produced in the last 16 months. And they're in reverse chronological order there. 85 in-depth stories on probably more than 70 topics. We focus on in-depth coverage of issues of statewide importance, because there is as newsrooms have been reduced in size, or as newspapers have gone away, the journalists in the state have tended to, they do more localized coverage and not so much coverage of statewide issues. So that's our sweet spot. If in every single case, all 85 of these stories, we were really the first organization to take an in-depth, serious look at those issues. 12 of those issues were taken up in the last legislative session. We have a crisis in this state with nursing homes. It was South Dakota News Watch that put together that it wasn't just a problem in Watertown or Mobridge or Sioux Falls, but this was a statewide issue. And then you saw that the governor made it part of her budget proposals and her platform to address that. The state legislature ended up increasing Medicaid reimbursement. That probably is the one thing that got where we got the most attention. But there have been others. We revealed that there are tens of thousands of individuals who register their RVs in South Dakota who do not live here. And guess what? They also register to vote. and they vote. Now, you can decide whether you think that is appropriate or not, but that had not been reported before. So there are, you know, if you go to some campgrounds or you go to a mail forwarding service, you may find that there are many people who claim that as their residence under penalty of perjury, and who actually vote from those areas. They vote absentee. So a number of issues we have brought to light. There's no opinion, no commentary, no editorials. This is simply an in-depth, sophisticated look at statewide issues. One supporter said, South Dakota News Watch does not fill a niche, it fills a void. Mainstream media in the state, they have absolutely embraced us. So all of our work we publish direct on our website, on our Facebook page, but you also will see it in the Argus Leader. You'll see it on Kello. You'll see it on Kello's website, and you'll see it on the front pages of daily newspapers throughout the state. You'll see it in weekly newspapers. So that has been wonderful. So what's ahead for South Dakota News Watch? We just added a second full-time investigative reporter. We stepped up our budget substantially this year, and due to the generosity of the people of the state, and we are completely dependent on donations and grants. There's no earned income, there's no advertising. So we think we can make an even greater difference this next year in tackling important issues. We broke a story this week about what's going on at Aurora Plains Academy in Plankinton. This is an intense youth treatment facility in Plankinton, South Dakota, and there are allegations, numerous allegations that the children and young adults there are subjected to various forms of abuse. But we'll see where that leads. But I have to tell you, I remain deeply concerned about us as a society, about us as a state, about us as a community. If people don't trust the work of professional journalists, and if we don't support and encourage the work of top-notch news organizations and news organizations that are truly committed to the truth. In this Wall Street Journal article that I mentioned, one person predicted that half of the newspapers in this country that we have today could be gone in 2 years. I find that absolutely chilling. And I hope that doesn't occur in South Dakota, because it would be devastating. But that's how serious a problem we're facing. Carl Bernstein, Woodward and Bernstein, the Washington Post, won the Pulitzer Prize for exposing the Watergate scandal. He delivered the Bow Lecture here at Augustana University a few months ago. And on the lecture circuit, he talks about the role of the journalist is to report the best obtainable version of the truth. The best obtainable version of the truth. Here's my call to action for you. This faith community has 7 principles. They are extraordinary. They are extraordinary. And they're printed on the back of your worship bulletin this morning. I assume they're there every week. I don't know if you ever do a reading of those, Mike. Do you?
Sometimes.
Wow. Let's just read those together. The 7 principles of this faith community, this faith congregation. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement and spiritual growth in our congregation. My favorite coming up. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The right of conscience for the use of the democratic process within our congregation and in society at large. The goal of our understanding, peace, liberty, and justice for all. respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Wow. Be conscientious news consumers. Be discerning news consumers. All right. Don't buy into all this cynicism that this is all fake news, but be careful about which sources of news and information you can trust, and distinguish between what I would call commentary or talking heads, or those who are, providing their opinions rather than those that are providing you with sound news and information where you can make up your own mind. One of my former students, Paul Glatter, a native South Dakotan, graduate of the University of South Dakota, is now a journalism professor in New York City. Paul Glatter. Paul had an article in Forbes just this past week. And it's a fine piece. A major shift in political and cultural life in our country means it is a good time for people to improve their own reading and learning habits. He then, in this article, goes on to say, here are my top 10 large journalistic brands where I believe you can obtain most often real reported facts. You can dispute his list. That's fine. Okay. You may not buy his arguments, his points as to why he believes some organizations and not others. All I'm saying is get engaged, seek to be well informed, and make sure that you understand the source of anything you are reading or passing along. What frightens me is on the internet, whether it's Facebook or any other social media platform, people freely share articles and they don't pay any attention to what the source of those articles are. That I think is irresponsible. I think I don't care so much what a blogger has to say or even what a commentator has to say or somebody's personal opinion. I want somebody who has some professionalism and objectivity. Those are the people I'm going to pay attention to, whether it's an individual or whether it's an organization. We have a problem in this country with media literacy or illiteracy. People are not sophisticated news consumers. I have to believe that this faith community is extremely well equipped to help lead us. South Dakota News Watch. Here's my ask of you. Check us out. All right. If you can determine we're out there. You can decide whether you want to trust us or not. But we believe that we are the absolute best source of in-depth coverage of issues that have statewide importance. And we'll talk about that more in our discussion here in a few minutes. This is an absolute privilege for me to be here. I thank you for being so attentive, and I salute this faith community for your adherence to your 7 principles. Thank you.
I want to give this check to South Dakota News Watch on behalf of this congregation, $125 to help with that.
Thank you so much.